If you're just joining us now, we will start probably at 3:02. Thank you for joining. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to give it one more minute before we start the SnapEd Toolkit Reviewer training. Thank you all for joining us for this training this afternoon. All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's SnapEd Toolkit Reviewer training. My name is Lisa Mays, and I'm going to be joined today by folks over at the SnapEd Toolkit team at the UNC Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention. Thank you everyone for volunteering to review interventions for potential inclusion in the SnapEd Toolkit. We do recognize that this is a volunteer effort and really appreciate the time that you are offering to help us expand this selection of interventions for SnapEd. Before we start today's webinar, we would like to review some housekeeping notes with you to improve your experience. We will be using the chat feature, we will not be using the chat feature during today's webinar. If you have a question, please feel free to share it at any time using the Q&A box. If you don't see or hear a response to your question right away, just note that may be answered at the end of the webinar. Your question will be shared privately. If it is a general question, we will respond to everyone with the answer in the Q&A box. And of course, some questions, as I mentioned, will be answered orally at the end of the webinar. As a participant, you are not connected to any audio features. Therefore, if you have a question, please be sure to share it through that Q&A box. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the SnapEd Toolkit early next week. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover today, first we will give an overview of the SnapEd Toolkit intervention review, followed by an overview of the scoring tool, and then an application of the re-aim framework to your scores in scoring the interventions, followed by a Q&A where we can answer those questions in that Q&A box. So first, I'm Lisa Mays. I am one of the nutritionists here at the USDA Food and Nutrition Service at the National Office for the SnapEd program, and I'll be providing you with an overview of the SnapEd Toolkit Intervention Review. Currently, the SnapEd Toolkit has a selection of 88 evidence-based interventions for use with the SnapEd program. Of course, you're welcome to use interventions that are not in the SnapEd Toolkit, but a great feature of the SnapEd Toolkit is knowing that these interventions are evidence-based for use in our program. The last intervention review occurred in 2015, and in 2016, the USDA Food and Nutrition Service I decided to convene the SNAP-Ed Toolkit work group to increase the selection of interventions that fit state-specific SNAP-Ed needs, increase innovation by encouraging adoption of interventions which reflect the most up-to-date research in the field of public health nutrition, and improve the transparency of the review process and criteria for inclusion. The intervention review is meant to expand the selection of new interventions in the SNAP-Ed Toolkit, so we'll have more than 88 for you to look through once this is all said and done. Also to provide clear feedback on areas of improvement to the intervention submitters so that they're able to understand what they can do to possibly be included in the next submission. And also to learn from this review period to improve the intervention review process in 2020. This intervention review is not meant to update the evidence-based approach category for existing interventions in the SNAP-Ed Toolkit. It's not meant to remove interventions from the SNAP-Ed Toolkit, and it's not meant to thoroughly change the intervention submission form or scoring tool. Again, it's just to expand our current selections. We have had discussions about updating other items in the toolkit, but we're just going to focus on adding new ones at this time. A quick note on the intervention scoring tool. There's not a specific point threshold for inclusion. For instance, if you have a total of 100 points, 51 doesn't automatically mean that something will be included. Numeric scores are provided for each section to help you frame your decision on whether an intervention should be included in the SNAP-Ed Toolkit or excluded at this time. Sort of a pass-fail. Should this intervention be included in the SNAP-Ed Toolkit? Not all interventions will have the same level of evidence or supporting materials. We recognize that some will be emerging interventions, practice tested, or research tested along that spectrum. Really what we're looking for here is to understand, does this intervention show sufficient evidence that it is appropriate for SNAP-Ed, and does it improve the lives of those that we seek to serve? I would like to thank all of the SNAP-Ed Toolkit Intervention Review Workgroup members. They've been absolutely instrumental in informing this process, not just the forms that you see here, but the entire review from how many reviewers we'll have in the group to exactly how to review things and submit. If I have neglected to include your name on this list, I do apologize, but thank you very much for the work that you have done through this multi-year process. Some important dates to keep in mind for our reviewers. You should have received an email with the interventions that you have been assigned and the associated intervention materials. You should have also received a link to the Qualtrics form to submit your score. Coming up on April 26th, for those who are assigned 3 interventions, we will ask you to submit your scores and comments via the Qualtrics system. Some of you have thankfully volunteered to review 4 or more assigned interventions. Thank you very much. For those of you, we'll make sure you have a little bit of extra time, and please submit your scores and comments via Qualtrics on May the 3rd. On May the 10th, we will be announcing the decisions on inclusion to the intervention developers so that they're able to understand if their interventions have been included in the SNAP-Ed Toolkit. And next, we will discuss how to use the intervention scoring tool.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniela Uslin, and I'm part of the UNC SNAP-Ed Toolkit team. I'll be talking today about using the intervention scoring tool from the mechanics side of things, because new for this year, we've converted the PDF version of the tool into Qualtrics. And later in the presentation, my colleague Tracy will go over the application of using the tool. So first, we'd like to start with a poll to assess your comfort with the tool now on Qualtrics. So we're going to launch this poll. So have you tried to access your Qualtrics scoring tool form? If you could go ahead and vote and be sure to hit submit, we'll get a nice summary of how the audience is feeling about the form. We'll give it a few more minutes, a few more seconds. Okay, The results are in, and a lot of folks haven't tried yet, which is great. So I'll really give you your first look into using the tool. So no shame in that, and let's get into it. It's good that you'll have these sort of in-depth instructions before you begin. So to begin, you should have received a link in your email sent on Monday, March 18th, which gives you access to your Qualtrics form. Use this link to start and stop your review as many times as you need. So Qualtrics will automatically save your work when you click outside of a text box or drop-down menu, so feel free to revisit as often times as you feel comfortable. The general format may look different than the PDF form, however, the information remains the same. So some differences are the review questions are in bold letters, and the intervention submission tool questions and the materials to review, the factors for the high score are below this. There's going to be a score option provided in a drop-down menu, which I'll show you on the next slide. So the drop-down menu does include 0, and that is because if you do not want to award any points, that is your option. We provide whole numbers, which is only really a guide for you to make a final determination. The scoring itself won't determine if the intervention is eligible for the toolkit submission or not. So all scores are required, and you will not be able to move to the next page until the required questions are answered. However, the comments are optional. So you can move throughout the pages without filling out the comments, but they are encouraged because we're going to use them as a tiebreaker in the event that an intervention received the same score. So the comments won't be shared with the intervention developers, but they are encouraged. Be sure to enter the intervention name exactly as it appears on the submission form on the beginning of your submission, and that's because it will repeat on each page of the tool, and that will help keep you organized, as well as making sure that for folks that are filling out multiple interventions, that you're certain which intervention you're scoring at that time. There's a progress bar indicated in orange. It will always say 0% and 100%, so the orange bar moving will indicate your progress, not that percentage. There's also navigation arrows at the bottom. You'll always be able to go back to your work and review or correct any submissions. However, you can't go forward until you fill out those required questions. The last page of the tool will summarize your points. And so this is really, again, to guide you for your final justification for whether or not to include the intervention into the toolkit. And you'll see also the intervention name on the top, which will keep your reviews organized. Something on the last part of the review is very important because you'll have two options. You'll be able to continue on by selecting yes to the next intervention should you have 2 other or 3 other interventions to review. However, if you select no, this means that all the information that you've submitted will be then submitted to us. So no is really a final no. However, if you want to return to this to the Qualtrics form to fill out the rest of the interventions at a different time, you can click yes. You cannot click anything and just click out and just go back to the link. So because Qualtrics automatically saves your information, you can visit as often as you want, as long as you don't click no. You can also return back to as many submission questions as you want by using the navigation arrow to go backward. Next, I'm going to trade this over to our my colleague Tracy to go over the application of the intervention scoring tool.
Great, thanks, Daniela. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to spend some time this afternoon talking about the application of the intervention scoring tool. We first wanted to provide a brief overview of the scoring tool. Most of you have likely already taken a look at it and noticed that the tool is grouped across the re-aim dimensions. So shown here are the associated maximum point values for each section. And these can give you a sense of which dimensions carry more weight, and then we'll call for greater emphasis as you review the intervention. So each section includes an overall question as well as section-specific questions that will help you to evaluate the re-aim dimension. So as I move through this training, you'll notice that the section-specific questions are grouped together based on their point values. So low point value questions are more straightforward and easier to answer, whereas the higher point value questions are more complex. So for some of the high point value questions, I'll spend some time breaking them down to provide a clearer sense of what they're asking. And also just a couple more overall points to keep in mind is that comments for each of the section-specific questions are encouraged, and that these scores, as Lisa mentioned before, will be used to inform your recommendation to either include or not include the intervention in the toolkit. So I'll move through the training in the same order as the re-aim dimensions are included in the scoring tool. And since the scoring tool is organized around the re-aim framework, we wanted to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of each dimension. Many of you are likely familiar with re-aim, but I will provide a brief overview of each dimension. And this overview will include information on how the dimension is defined, measured, and described. And then following this overview, I'll get more into how it will be reviewed using the scoring tool. So this is where we'll look more closely at the section-specific questions and provide some additional guidance around the questions with higher point values. So the first re-aim dimension is reach, which is defined as the number or percentage of people who are exposed to the intervention or people whose health may be improved as a result of the intervention. And reach is often reported as the total number of people affected or exposed to the intervention, but in order to determine the percentage of people reached, you'll need to address two components. The first being the number of people who would ideally be exposed to the intervention, which is the denominator in the reach calculation, and then the number of people who are actually exposed is the numerator. So the percentage of the target population that is actually exposed to the intervention measures reach. And within the reach dimension, it's important to examine the characteristics between those actually exposed versus those ideally exposed, or versus the whole population. And these comparisons check if the intervention reaches those most vulnerable or at risk, and thus helping to ensure that the intervention addresses health disparities and works towards health equity. So for reach, the overall review question asks, how many people are exposed or served, and are they representative? And there are two medium point value questions in reach. And the first one asks if the intervention reached the intended audience. So in order to answer this question, you should have a clear understanding of the target audience the intervention intended to reach. You can consider descriptors such as age, race, and ethnicity groups, as well as if the intervention was targeted toward a particular population group, like pregnant and breastfeeding women. Additionally, if data are available, look at those that actually participated as well as those who were eligible to participate in order to examine the intervention's reach. You'll also want to look here if the participants were representative of the target population. If the population reached was not representative, particularly if it reached a lower proportion of underserved or at-risk subgroups, this will affect your evaluation of reach and in turn the public health impact of the intervention. So for the second medium point value question, which has you assess if the intervention is appropriate for the intended audience, you'll want to look for evidence from the intervention's design or early implementation processes showing how it was tailored to the needs or preferences of the target audience. You can also look for supporting evidence showing if or how the intervention's acceptability was assessed and what improvements were made. You'll also want to consider here if the resources needed, resources needed, such as required materials, time, or staff. So the next re-aim dimension is effectiveness, which is defined as how well the intervention affects a change in the intended outcomes and whether or not there are unanticipated outcomes. And measuring effectiveness answers the question, what is the impact of the intervention on intended outcomes, including positive or negative unanticipated outcomes? And within the effectiveness dimension, it's important to be clear about the outcomes that the intervention was trying to achieve. And these outcomes would have been specified when developing the intervention and when planning upfront for its evaluation. So for the effectiveness section, the overall question asks, what is the impact of the intervention on the intended outcomes? And there's some questions included in this section with smaller maximum point values. And these questions will have you examine aspects of effectiveness that include assessing the level of involvement from the target audience or community partner during the intervention development process, looking for evidence documenting the acceptability of the intervention by participants or partners, and examining if process evaluation measures are provided. And there are additional questions that include maximum point values of 5 or 6. And for one of these questions, you'll examine if the intervention addresses multiple levels of the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework or multiple levels of the socio-ecological model. So if we think about this in terms of the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework, you'll first need to think about how the intervention improves and sustains individuals' healthy eating and or physical activity behaviors, starting from the individual's goals and intentions to making and maintaining behavior changes. Then at the environmental level, you'll want to examine if the intervention resulted in new or enhanced organizational practices, rules, or procedures that make healthy choices easier and more desirable. And lastly, when considering sectors of influence, think about the extent to which the intervention works with other sectors to collectively impact lifelong healthy eating and active living in low-income communities. Another review question with a maximum point value of 6 will have you evaluate the available evidence suggesting effective implementation of the intervention if it were to be adopted by other SNAP-Ed agencies. So for this question, you'll want to think about the extent to which behavior change theory is addressed through the intervention method, and if there is success of other interventions that have used a similar behavior change theory and strategies. And lastly, in this section, there are questions with higher maximum point values of 8 and 10. And given these higher values, we'll take a closer look at these two questions, starting with a question addressing the intervention's intended outcome. So this question, which has a maximum point value of 10 points, asks, do intended outcomes indicate that objectives were appropriately addressed? So in breaking this question down, you first should be able to list the outcomes achieved as a result of the intervention and also describe any unintended or unanticipated consequences. You'll want to ask yourself, how likely is it that the positive effects outweigh the negative effects of the intervention? And you'll also want to look for detailed data that support the achievement of these outcomes. Based on your assessment of this data, think about your level of confidence that the intervention was responsible for the positive outcomes that have been observed and documented, and also consider the strength of the evidence documented improved outcomes, as well as alternative explanations for those positive outcomes. It's also important here to assess the quality of the methods used to collect the outcome data. You may want to consider things like if a systematic data collection approach was used, if data collectors were properly trained, or if the timing of when the data was collected was appropriate. Overall, you want to evaluate whether the tools, data, and analytic methods used do an acceptable job of capturing the critical information related to the intervention's outcomes. And the second and only other high point value question in this section asks, does supporting documentation indicate that the intervention is evidence-based at a level that is appropriate for the intervention stage of development? So to answer this question, you'll first need to reference the checklist for evidence-based approaches to help you determine if the intervention is considered evidence-based. And this same checklist was used by the intervention submitter for question 24 on the submission tool when selecting the appropriate evidence-based approach for the intervention. So checking if this designation is appropriate will require you to take a close look at the supporting evidence that was included in the submission and reflect back on the quality of the evaluation tools, data, and analytic methods. And you'll also want to consider here if the resources used for such an evaluation are generally available in the practice setting. So the next renamed dimension is adoption, which is defined as the characteristics and number of settings adopting the intervention. And essentially a setting is any place or entity where the intervention can be implemented and where there's an opportunity to connect with the target population. And measuring adoption is similar to that we discussed for REACH. Looking at the number of settings that could adopt the intervention is the denominator, and the number of settings that actually adopt the intervention is the numerator. Therefore, the percentage of settings that actually adopt the intervention measures adoption. It's important to examine if there are differences between the settings that do and do not adopt the intervention. Some characteristics to compare between the settings could include size, type, capacity, or culture. You're trying to understand if the settings that actually adopt the intervention are representative of all the settings that could adopt it. For the adoption section, the overall question asks, how many settings or sectors are involved and are they representative? So there's some smaller point value questions in this section that have you report on if intervention materials are available at no cost, if the intervention has been used by low-income audiences, and on the adoption of the intervention by site, settings, or partners. There are two medium point value questions in this section, one of which has you consider the appropriateness of the intervention for the setting where it's implemented. So here you can think about appropriateness in terms of if the resource needs for adoption, such as materials or time, are feasible for adoption. Additionally, you can consider the intervention's appropriateness in terms of how well the setting reaches the SNAP-Ed target audience and or how accessible the setting is to those in need. And the second medium point value question in this section looks at how the intervention engages partners in order to affect change across multiple levels of the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework or the socio-ecological models. So you can look here at if there are a mix of partners across varying sectors of influence that could enhance the ability of the setting to reach the SNAP-Ed target audience or be accessible by communities in need. So moving to the next REAIM dimension, which is implementation. And implementation is defined as the extent to which the intervention is delivered as intended or designed. To measure implementation, the activities that are required to implement the intervention are examined. And these required activities are the key components that must be completed for the intervention to be effective. And to examine if these activities are occurring as intended, process measures that capture data on each of the activities are used. And within the implementation dimension, it's important to look at the time it takes to implement the intervention and if the implementation costs are compatible with available resources. And the complexity of the intervention also needs to be considered to check if all the steps for implementation are reasonable and feasible to implement as intended. So the overall review question for implementation asks, were the required activities of your intervention successfully implemented? In this section, there are questions with small, medium, and high point values. There's one small point value question that looks at the availability of training materials for staff, partners, and or volunteers. And there are also 2 medium point value questions, one of which has you evaluate how clear and easy to follow the implementation directions and materials are. Here you can consider how appropriate the materials are in terms of matching the knowledge and experience level of the intended user. And you can also consider if there is a logical flow of implementation steps. And the second medium point value question has you look more closely at methods used to ensure program fidelity. So consider here if there were systems in place to monitor the quality of the data, of the intervention's delivery, and if the developers measured the extent to which the steps or components of the interventions were implemented as intended. You'll also want to think here about if the capacity, such as in terms of staff, skill, or funding, that is required to properly implement the intervention is generally available in similar settings. Lastly, there's one question in this section with a maximum of 8 possible points, which has you assess if the intervention's main components or critical features are reasonably feasible to replicate with fidelity. So in order to assess this, you can consider the following aspects. First, you should have a clear understanding of what resources are needed for implementation, and these resources may include things like staff or funding needs, or the level of skill or expertise needed for intervention delivery and monitoring. Next, you'll want to take a look at how well the methods used actually ensure the intervention's fidelity. For example, was there a standard system in place for documenting the implementation process? Think about the quality and consistency of the methods for ensuring intervention fidelity. And lastly, you'll want to consider adoption of the intervention by another organization, specifically one with limited resources, and think about if the intervention could be replicated in such a setting. So the final dimension of REAIM is maintenance, which can be measured at both the individual and setting levels, and it includes the long-term effects of the intervention and its sustainability. Measuring maintenance is determined from examining if the intervention produces lasting effects, and examining if there is consistent support from the staff, settings, partners involved is also needed to ensure the longevity of the intervention. And within the maintenance dimension, it's important to consider if there is adequate funding and partner engagement supporting the intervention sustainability. The overall review question for maintenance asks, what are the long-term effects of your initiative and is it sustainable? And there are 3 smaller point questions in this section that ask if the intervention has been adopted by partners in settings not directly supported by SNAP-Ed, if there is evidence showing maintenance of the outcomes, and if materials are available at no or low cost on an ongoing basis. And then there's one medium point value question that looks at if the intervention components can be adapted for use in settings beyond that described in the submission form. So it may be helpful here to think about any concerns in terms of the resources needed, the complexity of the intervention, or compatibility of the intervention for multiple audiences or settings that may impact its adaptation to different settings. Finally, there's one high point value question in this section, which addresses concerns about the long-term sustainability of the intervention. So here we can think about different aspects of these concerns as they relate to the intervention. First, it's worth looking at the total number of concerns identified and the extent to which these concerns impact the maintenance of the intervention. You'll also want to clearly understand the resources needed for the maintenance of the intervention and balance these needs with available and ongoing funding streams, as well as long-term partner involvement. And it would also be worth noting here both the number as well as the diversity of current and potential partners and funding streams. And you may have to pull some of these pieces together yourself in order to more fully evaluate the sustainability concerns and their impact on the maintenance of the intervention. So following the maintenance section, there are 3 bonus questions. And these questions have you consider if the intervention reaches an underrepresented audience or setting, and if the intervention uses an approach or strategy that is currently underutilized in the toolkit. So for these questions, you'll use the information provided in the factors for a high score to help you answer them. So when you're completing the review tool and before you get into the final questions, it will be helpful here to look back at how you scored the different sections. You may notice a low score in a particular section that may indicate a gap in the information provided, or it could show an area where the intervention needs more work or further development. So taking a look at the scoring can help you both reflect on the specific sections as well as on the intervention as a whole. And this information will then be helpful as you move towards deciding if you would recommend the intervention for inclusion in the toolkit. Additionally, if there are differences among reviewers in terms of the decision to include or not include the intervention in the toolkit, these scores can serve as a helpful starting point to see where discrepancies between reviewers may be occurring. So the final section of the review tool begins with the question that asks if you recommend the intervention for inclusion in the toolkit. And here is where it will be important for you to spend some time justifying your decision or describing your reasoning behind your recommendation. Additionally, if you do not recommend the intervention should be included in the toolkit, please do take some time to describe any additional information or actions that would be needed to recommend the intervention for inclusion in the toolkit. And if there's agreement among reviewers to not include the intervention in the toolkit, the information provided in these questions will be valuable feedback to share with the intervention developer. And this information will also be used when comparing the review results across the 3 different reviewers. So please do take the time to be specific and also thorough when answering these final questions. So we're gonna launch one more poll here. And it is just asking going forward, what, if any, are your preferred methods for additional support as you move through the review period? And you can check all that apply.
Another couple seconds.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for this feedback. We will take a closer look at it and definitely follow up with the support that you all have indicated. And now I will turn it over to Molly, who's going to facilitate the Q&A piece.
Thanks, Tracy. Hey there, this is Molly DeMarco with the UNC SnapEd Toolkit team. We've had 2 questions come in during the presentation. One was asking whether we can provide these slides to reviewers, and yes, we'll either email them or post them, but we will let you know so you have them, absolutely. We got another question about whether there is a document to help y'all determine the USDA's guidelines around research tested, practice tested, emerging. This person said it would be particularly helpful for answering the 5th question under effectiveness. We just wanted to point out that there is a checklist in the guidance. It is in Appendix B in the templates section. Okay, so if folks have other questions, please do type them into the Q&A. We have another question that's come in. I'm just going to read it, and anyone on our panel can answer. Regarding REACH calculations, If an intervention is developed for a class of settings, so schools, food banks, etc., how should reach to individuals be estimated? It doesn't seem like there would be enough information.
So this is Tracy. So you said if the intervention is delivered to schools or food banks?
Right. Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. If an intervention is developed for a class of settings.
Oh, class.
Yeah, how should reach to individuals be estimated?
I guess I would encourage them to get as specific as possible. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, say for example, the schools, start with the number of schools, if there are demographics in terms of the population that those schools reached, and then if there are also numbers involved there, those would be ways to kind of get at the total number reached. And then you could also look at the schools that are participating versus the schools that aren't, and then see if there are differences in terms of the population groups that the schools reach between the two. That's helpful.
Thanks, Tracy.
Sure.
Next question we got, is there a certain way comments need to be phrased? For example, with HRSA grant reviews, you always phrase in terms of weaknesses of the application. Any of our panelists have any suggestions there about how to phrase comments?
I'm going to take this. This is Lisa over at FNS. So one thing that I would have folks keep in mind is that particularly those comments on why an intervention was excluded are going to be shared with the intervention developer. So I would refrain from, although they are going to be anonymized, so they don't know the specific reviewer that provided it. Of course, we all know a lot of work has gone into these interventions, so I would say, make sure you're using your nice words. I'm sure everyone would do that anyway, but there's not a very specific language that we're going to restrict you to. However, phrases that are very clear and help people understand what they need to do as far as improving their intervention are always very helpful. So for instance, as you mentioned here, a weakness of the application perhaps was that the evidence base was not sufficient to show that this intervention works for a low-income audience. We would suggest, additional research to see if it works with low-income individuals. Something like that. Just knowing that we're here to help advance interventions and make sure that they work well for the field. So to give specific feedback and also potentially thoughts for how someone can improve.
Thank you, Lisa. Another question that we just received regarding institutions' adoption. How do you advise accommodating variations among institutions? For example, readiness for change, state of change, diffusion of innovation, such as innovators, early adopters, laggards. Any of our panelists want to take that?
It's a good question. I mean, if I think I'm understanding it, I think you could almost break down your adoption into subgroups of sorts, and so you could, depending on where the different settings are in sort of the spectrum of sorts in adopting it or readiness to adopt, kind of have some subcategories that would then help to kind of further classify. So it's not just an all or none, but it gives you additional breakdown in terms of addressing kind of where the different settings are in the process.
Thanks, Tracy. Oh, and another question. For the maintenance sustainability section, wouldn't it be important to look at instruments, attachments, and so forth to see if they address the essential components?
This is Tracy. So yeah, I guess I see looking at the tools used and if they are capturing the right metrics or whatnot as part of what is wrapped into the effectiveness section of it all. I mean, there's a lot of fluidity, I think, just across the different dimensions and looking at it as a whole. But certainly, I think making sure that the tools and the data that's used and collected is measuring the right thing and that it's of good quality would be important. And I guess maybe in terms of the maintenance, if those are measured over the long term, are there also adequate tools involved to capture that over time would also be important.
Thanks, Tracy. The next question we have, a reviewer is asking whether folks who submit can appeal a decision, or do they just need to reapply later?
And this is Lisa at SNS. I'm going to take that one. So individuals, if they feel that they have received a poor score, of course, are welcome to send, I would say, an email to the SnapEd Toolkit team, which would be shared with us. However, we do respect the expertise and obviously the informed opinions of our reviewers, and we would, be willing to take another look at that. But rather, we would suggest that people would resubmit, in particular, resubmit with addressing some of the issues that they may have received during in the comments from the reviewers. But they can, people can always ask a question. I would just say that we recognize that the reviewers that have volunteered their time are quite knowledgeable about SnapEd, and we do respect their opinion.
Thanks, Lisa. The next question we have is about bonus questions and whether there is a summary of gaps in toolkit topics such as audience, settings, sector of influence.
Yeah, this is Tracy. I didn't go into those specifics when in the presentation, but if you look on the submission or the review tool under the factors for the high score, they are listed out there. So, for example, for an underrepresented audience, the factors for a high score information identifies where there's less than 30% of the interventions are currently representing particular population groups. So it's in there in the review tool for them to refer to. I just didn't go into specifics about it in the presentation.
Thanks, Tracy. So the final question we have at this point is, under effectiveness, I don't see anything in the scoring criteria about needing to use valid and reliable assessment tools that have been specifically tested in the target population. Are we not scoring on that?
This is Tracy, and I think it's a great question, and I think that I would think that that is wrapped up into the effectiveness section in terms of sort of looking at things overall and looking at the quality of the tools that were used and the data analysis method. So I do think it is important to consider, and they're right. I guess the person posing the question is right, is that it's not specifically scored upon, but I see it as wrapped up, within the consideration for that section.
And this is Lisa. I'll add a note to that, the assessment tools, we understand that through the You know, for some interventions, they might not be there yet, for instance, for an emerging intervention, but this is, you know, you may not have assessment tools for everything that you need, or they may not be validated at this time, but this is certainly something to consider. You know, would you be able to, as a SNAP-Ed implementer, implement this intervention and assess if you are being effective out in the field?
Thank you. So another question is, what is the relation of Toolkit to indicators outcomes in the framework?
So I'll say with the, and this is Lisa again, with the SNAP-Ed Toolkit, as far as the interventions toolkit, one of the things that is very useful about that tool is that there are, in the summary of each intervention, there are indicators listed which that intervention might address. And I think that that's one of the great ways that people can use, you know, the SNAP-Ed Toolkit website, as it integrates not only the interventions toolkit, but also the SNAP-Ed framework. And it really incorporates those two resources together.
Thank you, Lisa. Those are all the questions we've received. If anyone still has questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A. Do note that on this last slide, we have how you can contact us. We will make sure that y'all receive the slides. And we will make sure that y'all, that we address how you all were interested in getting more help going forward. If we do it via office hours or email, etc., we will get that information out too. We've had a couple more questions come in. Just to clarify the last answer about the indicators from the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework. The question is whether submitters cited indicators in their, I'm guessing that means in their application.
This is Tracy. Yeah, there is a question in there that we encourage, or that in the submission tool that encourages the submitters to identify indicators from the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework for their intended outcomes. And we also did a training for the intervention submitters, and we did highlight this in the training. So there is a question on the submission tool. So the reviewers will be receiving the information that has that direct link with the outcomes, a part of the SNAP-Ed evaluation framework.
Thanks, Tracy. One more question. What do we do if we see their statistical approach is way off base? Do we provide specific comments as to what changes are needed?
This is Tracy. I would say most definitely. I think that would be great feedback to include in the final section, as well as in the reviewer comments where they're related to the specific questions, because I think that sort of thing will be key feedback to give to the intervention developer if it's not chosen to be included in the toolkit.
Thank you. Well, seeing no more questions coming in, I'm pausing. But like I said, we'll make sure you get the help and the information you need. Okay, I'm going to take this one last question. Or these last two questions. Sorry, y'all. Do you have a profile of 85 interventions? For example, the audience sites, etc. Do you have a profile of the 85 interventions?
If I'm not sure if they're meaning the 80 or the ones that are in the current toolkit now. They can look on this. If they look on the SnapEd Toolkit website, there's a list of all of the interventions, but then there's also a page there where you can, it's called Find an Intervention, I think, and you can search the all of those interventions by particular or specific information to kind of narrow down whether it's direct ed or PSE or whatnot. So if you look at SnapEd Toolkit website, I think if I'm understanding correctly, that's where all of those are currently listed, that you could find those.
Thank you. Another question about more details on the stats question. A common mistake is that people do an intervention in a classroom or other setting and don't understand that it is a cluster design. How in the weeds do we get on that?
This is Lisa, and one of the things I'm just really going to stress, and I know that this is something that we look at with, you know, things like reviews and grant reviews and things. If there's feedback that if you were the intervention developer and you had submitted an intervention and you would have felt that some piece of feedback was helpful. So for instance, you know, a suggestion that we would, you know, this is supposed to be a cluster design because it's in a classroom setting, you know, feel free to volunteer that information to somebody. Your expertise that you have, you may be looking at something that they haven't had the bandwidth to address just yet, but you're welcome to provide that information in your feedback to the intervention submitter.
Thank you. So another question just came in. I'm just reading it. This person says, I think that the person is asking about the profiles. How are we supposed to know the appropriate audience reach, number of sites, those denominators? Do you have that somewhere in a profile versus us reading through the documents and trying to figure those out, or what those denominators were supposed to be?
Again, I think if I'm understanding the question, in the submission, in the intervention submission document, the applicants are encouraged to provide all of that information. So hopefully the reviewer shouldn't need to be digging too deep in order to find that. And again, this is something that we also included in the training to the intervention developers. So hopefully the information should be somewhat readily available when they get the intervention document, because we did work with them to try to make sure that that is included in their submission tool.
Thank you. We just have one more minute. There's a couple more questions coming in, trying to read through them really quickly, but this one says, and would we score accordingly? That would seem like a big omission to me, not recognizing that it is a cluster design. And I would probably score very low, but may have conflict with other reviewer scores who either aren't aware of this or note it, but it doesn't impact the scoring. I'm just trying to be consistent. That's the question.
So go ahead. Go ahead. Go for it, Tracy.
No, it's okay. You're fine.
I would say this is one of those areas where and And the good news, to take a little pressure off, is you are not the only individual reviewing this particular intervention. So we understand that some reviewers may be hard on certain aspects, and other reviewers may be, easier on that particular aspect. This is your expert review. This is your expert opinion. And if you think that this is something that significantly lowers the score of this review, then that's a valid score for you to include and valid feedback for you to include. Other reviewers may see it differently. And as we see the scores come in, if things are, significantly misaligned, we may be revisiting and asking for additional clarification from the reviewers. But the reason we're so happy to have your help is because there is varying expertise among our reviewers. So please do, score as you see fit.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you all for the good questions, and thanks to our team for the presentation. Again, we will get you all out the information that you need, and thank you so much for volunteering to do this for the SnapEd team nationwide. Have a good rest of your day, y'all. Bye-bye.